is Robert Sungenis coming to you on the Robert Sungenis Live program, this time for January 4 in the year of our Lord 2023. So glad you could be with us. Hopefully, you remembered that our time has changed from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. On Wednesdays to 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. every Wednesday, as long as I am healthy and able to come to the studio. And thank you for coming again today. And I hope that we have a wonderful program for you. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your question to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, scripture, tradition, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the doctors, the saints, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, and just about anything I can find to have you satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. As I said, we come to you every Wednesday now from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. And usually I'll have a topic at the head of the program that I want to talk about. But, as I say, most of the time there's so much going on that if I started talking about the hot topics out there, we wouldn't have time for your questions. So I'm going to minimize those topics as much as possible this coming year so that I can answer your questions forthwith. And you will hopefully be satisfied with that. And so without further ado, let me go to some questions we do have some email questions, but I'm going to hold off on those and get right to the questions on the board here. All right, so let me see. Let's see. All right, so we have a lot of good thoughts coming, but no questions. So, here's a question from Robert Dean on Judges 16:28 to 30, who asks, was the situation with Samson's death an act of sacrifice to God, or as some say, it was suicide? Well, no, I wouldn't call it suicide. Suicide would be an occasion where, Samson is in solitude somewhere, and he is despairing of life and by himself. That's usually the way suicide occurs, by oneself. And he's so despairing that, he takes his own life. This was not that occasion. The Philistines were his mortal enemies. As you can tell if you read the book of Judges, back and forth they went for 360 years was the period of the Judges. And out of that, the Philistines had control of the Israelites for 40-year stretches that sometimes, let me see, there were probably about 5 of those. So sometimes it was 20 years, sometimes 40, depending on how much God was going to punish the Israelites for their sins, as was usually the case. But the Philistines had captured Samson and tied his both arms to 2 different pillars in their temple. And Samson figured out that the best way to kill as many Philistines as possible at that time was to just use his strength and pull those pillars toward himself, which would mean, of course, that he would die as well, but he would die in battle, let's say. That would be the way to put it. He would die an honorary death because, no, it wasn't suicide. It was just like a soldier going on the front lines. I mean, he's basically putting his life at risk to kill as many of the enemy as he can. And no one would call that suicide. So same with Samson. He's at war with the Philistines. And so this is the best way he can, as straddled as he was at the time, to take advantage of the situation and fight a war right there in the temple of the Philistines. And 3,000, that's a pretty good match. 1 to 3,000, yeah, he did a good job. So his death would be more martyr like than suicide, of course, because knowing that he's going to lose his life but accomplish the purpose of God to destroy these pagan Philistines gives him that credit. So, okay, see where else we are today. All right, question. Is it a sin to revolt against an illegitimate government? Well, no, would not be a sin, but you would have to have proof that it's an illegitimate government. And you would have to have a great majority of the people who agree with that assessment. And sometimes that's not too hard today, of course, but um, you would do as much as you could to unseat that illegitimate government by putting in a government that the people all agree to, or the most of them agree to, as opposed to a coup, a military coup that would come in and kill the president or the king and take over. Of course, that's an illegitimate government because governments are not supposed to be formed that way. And provided that, and this has happened sometimes in history, where the people rose up, armed themselves against the illegitimate government, and took it back. Um, it has happened, not very often, but it has happened. So to answer your question, no, it would not be a sin to revolt against an illegitimate government. Got a question here from Roberto. The last question there was from John Fredette or Free. I don't know where the accent would there be, John, but the next question is from Roberto, who says, God fights for the sinner to the very end. True or false? Fights for the sinner to the end? I don't know. That is a non sequitur because God will not fight for the sinner at all. Okay. So, not sure where your question is originating from. Maybe if you want to ask it again and give some context, I can give you a better answer. But let's just look at this in general. In this world, no one is guaranteed the protection from God, at least physically. Spiritually, we have all kinds of guarantees from God that if we are obedient to Him, if we are doing the right thing, there's no sin involved. We have God's guarantee that He will preserve us spiritually. That is, we will not fall into sin and lose the faith in the process of living out our lives. But ever since the time of Adam and Eve, who sinned, we have no guarantee of the physical protection of God. And you can even see this in the life of Jesus. For example, it says in John 8, 56, maybe, where the Pharisee, he's having this dialogue from John chapter 5, and it ends in John chapter 8. And in the process of the dialogue, Jesus agitates the Pharisees so much that they want to kill him. And it says, and Jesus hid himself from them. Okay. So what does this tell us? Well, even Jesus, the Son of God, is not going to stand there and say, well, God will protect me and I have nothing to worry about. These Pharisees pick up stones and, I'm impervious to all that. So let them throw their stones as much as they want. No, that's not the way he's thinking it out. He's thinking like any normal person who is not going to be presumptuous that God is going to protect him in a certain situation. And this is a lesson that each Christian has to seriously, incorporate into his Christian life. Presuming on God to do a certain thing is basically a sin. And that's why the psalmist, I forget where he says it, he says, Lord, save me from presumptuous sin. So that's a different kind of sin than murder or stealing or whatever. Presumptuous sin is presuming that God will do this or that when God has no plans to do this or that. We just don't know what God's plans are. We know in general what they are, but we can't, in a certain situation, we can't dictate that God's going to have to act in a certain way. Okay. I mean, look at abortion in our land. It's been 50 years since we even took a second look at it. And one institution just basically passed the buck to the other institution. This is as much as we got. And someone could say, well, where's God? Where's God in all this? And many people have asked that question. Why does God allow this to go on? Well, we can't presume to speak for God or to act for God. We know as a truth that God allows evil in this world because he has a greater, infinite picture of how things are going to be and how they should turn out based on the sin of the people, the sin of the leaders, and all things are taken into account. So God acts the way he does justly when he wants to act, and we can never presume on him. Okay. We even see this, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, I believe it is around chapter 22, where the apostles and Jesus are in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus says to them, remember when I told you to take no purse, take no scrip, and take no sword? And they say, yes, we do remember. And he says, did you lack for anything? And they say, no. He says, but now I'm going to tell you, take a scrip, take a purse, and take a sword. Okay. So here is a dramatic change from what and Luke is the only one who covers this story. It's at the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is just about to be arrested by Judas and the Sanhedrin and the Roman soldiers. And Jesus says this monumental statement, take a sword. And this is actually, they're coming out of the Last Supper when he says this. And they're walking to the Garden of Gethsemane, he and the apostles. And one of the apostles, I think it's Peter, who says, here, Lord, there's two swords. Now, this is just right after Jesus said, take a sword. In other words, your life after I am killed and rise from the dead is going to be a lot different than it is now. Now, a lot of the Jews who are your friends are not going to be your friends after I die and rise from the dead. I mean, after all, these are the very people that said, crucify him, crucify him. Okay. So friends are going to be at a minimum for the apostles. And you can tell that as they start their journey in the book of Acts. In almost every chapter, the Jews are chasing them and wanting to kill them. Okay. So this is not going to be like it was in Jesus's day, where he goes from town to town, the apostles are with him and they preach the gospel, and Jesus he cures the people miraculously, sometimes raises them from the dead. And yes, he has enemies, but it's not at a fever pitch. And that's not going to come until the events of the cross and afterward. So, and especially the Romans too, they don't want any hint that somebody's going to take the kingship from or the emperorship from Caesar. And so the apostles are not going to be favored by the Romans either, the Romans or the Jews. So Jesus says, take a sword. And that is to defend yourself. It's not going to be like, Jesus is saying, take a sword and we're going to go on a crusade and, kill all the evil people. No, that's not what's in his mind. What's in his mind is to defend themselves in case they have to with a sword. And I think it's Peter, as I said, when he says, well, here, Lord, there's two swords. Well, where is he getting those from? He's probably getting them from the owner of the upper room where they had the Last Supper, because in those days, you would put your swords on the wall, just like people do today. They put their guns on the wall, or their archery or whatever it is, and they even put the animals that they killed on their walls to, just to let people know, hey, the owner of this house has a gun, so don't try anything stupid. It would just be a natural symbol that, if we have to, we'll protect ourselves, and here are the swords to prove it. So Peter sees these swords on the wall. I'm picturing how it probably went, and says, hey, Lord, there's two swords there. And what is Jesus' response? He says, all right, it's enough. Let's go. In other words, Peter wasn't getting the message. He basically was concentrating on the sword part of Jesus's message and forgot about the scrip and the purse. In other words, Jesus is saying, look, you're going to go into a different world now, and you're going to have your own money. You're going to have your own clothes, your own food. And by the way, you're also going to need a sword to protect yourself. Okay, so that message didn't get clear to Peter, so he says, forgets the purse and the scrip and the food and the clothing, and says, hey, here's two swords. And Jesus says, all right, let's not get into this right now. We have greater things to do. And then they go out of the Last Supper, and they walk to the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where the great battle's going to be. And and so Peter probably takes one of those swords, and that's the reason he cuts off Malchus's ear. And he probably, in that situation, he wasn't like aiming for Malchus's ear. This is the Roman soldier, by the way, at the Garden of Gethsemane, the same soldiers that came to arrest Jesus. He's not say, oh, there's Malchus's ear. Let me give him a taste of my, my prowess, and he'll learn his lesson. Now, he was probably aiming for his head to chop it off, because he misunderstood Jesus's message about the sword coming out of the Last Supper, and and thought, oh, well, this is what Jesus means. Now I'm supposed to attack with the sword. And of course, that wasn't the message Jesus was giving him. Peter, as usual, just didn't get it until, many days or months afterward, and acted presumptuously or impetuously, and chopped off this guy's ear, but he was probably aiming for his head. And Malchus probably moved his head a little bit, and so all Peter could hit was the ear, you see. And this makes sense, because you would ask yourself, well, what sense is there in chopping off someone's ear? Okay. He missed Malchus and chopped off his ear. That's what happened. And of course, Jesus is saying to Peter, look, Peter, I know I told you to take a sword, but if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. Okay, so you totally missed my message. I wish there was some bylines in the Gospels so you could read, as they say, between the lines, and find out what was going on. But that's my job. That's what I do in my Bible commentary for you, in case you wanted to know what it was all about. I try to fill in those between the lines details for you, so that you know why things are happening the way they are. Because sometimes the gospel writers, they'll just tell you what happened, but they not all the time will tell you why it happened or whose motivation was this or who's the instigator or whatever. Okay. So the point of all this, of course, is to say that in this world, we are going to have to defend ourselves. Okay. We cannot depend on God, not that God is not willing to help, but look, we're in a sinful state, and this is what Adam gave us, and this is the way things operate now. And so you better beware that there may be times where, someone may come into your house and want to rape your women and steal your money, and what are you going to do? Sit there and dribble with your lips? No, you're going to try to defend yourself. And that's why some of us, will go packing, as they say. And you're going to need that in the violent world. Not that you go out into the world now and say, hey, bang, 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 I'm going to, shoot as many bad people as I can. That would be the total opposite of what Jesus means. Okay. So it's the kind of world we live in. I hope I answered your question. All right. How much can you bench press? I can bench press, I don't know, probably 200 pounds or so, not that much. So just put that into your little biography of Robert Sungenis there, Lawrence, and someday. All right, David says, he has to go to work, so he isn't able to watch the program. I'm sorry, David. I knew there was going to be some casualties resulting from the time change that I have imposed. But as you can see, I have a lot more energy at 3 p.m. than I often do at 8 p.m. And so I just figured that out. Well, getting older, Robert, so you're going to have to change the time, and I think it's going to work out. All right. Treacles Piste. I don't know. I think that's a pseudonym. Where could we find your take on Fatima's Our Lady's info about the girl in purgatory? I'm not familiar with any of Our Lady's description of seeing a girl in purgatory. I'm not even familiar with Our Lady showing purgatory. I know Our Lady showed hell to the three seers, the three child seers, but not purgatory and not a girl in purgatory. So you're going to, if you think that is the case, then you're going to have to give source material for that. And if you do find it, pass it along to me because I've never heard of it myself. So for now, it's a big no for that question. Question: do you think the Eliakim Isaiah 22:22 connection is a good apologetic for the papacy? Yes, I do, as long as it's not taken too far, because there's just a lot of connections between Matthew 16 and Isaiah 22 that really can't be denied. And one of them that I like the best is the master of the palace idea. The master of the palace, what is it in Hebrew? I forget the specific phrase in Hebrew, but in English it translates to master of the palace. And this is a position that was held for all the kings of Israel and Judah and Benjamin. The king was the supreme leader, and then he had beneath him the master of the palace. Still trying to remember that Hebrew. Habayeth. Yeah, there's a word before Habayeth. Anyway, that would be comparable to the president of the United States having his chief of staff. Okay. You could call him chief of house, chief of White House. He's directly underneath the president, and he basically calls the shots in the White House. And each king of Israel had one of these, Habayeth. And that's basically the position that Peter is filling. By the way, you can look for this Hebrew phrase, Habayeth, and it appears probably a half a dozen times in the Old Testament. It doesn't mention the Habayeth for all the kings, only certain kings, because when this master of the palace or Habayeth had a certain job to do, then that's the reason Scripture would mention it. He became important at that time, and therefore he's mentioned. But each king had a master of the palace. And Jesus basically is the king, and the Pope is the vicar. He's not the king. And that is just like the position that was held in the Old Testament of the master of the palace. You could say that Peter is the master of the church. Okay. So he's fulfilling that same role that Isaiah 22 and many other passages speak about, wherein he's like the second in command. He's not the king, but he's the vicar, or he's the vice regent, or he's the master of the palace, whatever. So in that sense, it fits like a glove, Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. And there are probably 3 or 4 other connections that we don't have to get into right now. But in that sense, yes, it's a good apologetic for the papacy, because it shows that the papacy, the whole idea of the papacy or the vicar of Christ, did not come out of a vacuum. Like this was first thought up by the church, and oh, that's a great idea. Let's use that. No, this whole idea of having a vicar to the king was a precedent set in the Old Testament, you see. So, in that sense, yeah, it has precedent. It's not a dumb idea, a crazy idea that someone had someday. This is the best way it works, and it works in both testaments, Old and New. Okay, so in that sense, it is good. All right. Jason Elliott says, this may be an odd question, but what is the difference in a day and a year in the geocentric model? Okay, that's a fair question. A day is 24 hours, and this started on day 1 of Genesis. Okay, it says, and there was evening and morning, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. And that means it was 24 hours, because each of the days is going to follow the same rhythm. Okay. So, in the geocentric sense, what is a day? Well, a day is when the sun goes around the earth one time, and that takes 24 hours. Okay. That's easy enough to understand. Okay. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we now have to include the universe of stars and the moon. And so now we have to answer the question, what is the sun moving, or how is it moving in relation to the stars? Okay. Now, God says in Genesis 1:14-19 that he made the sun, stars, and the moon for times and seasons, and I forget what the third one is, for times and seasons. Okay, so let's just go with that. So he made them, and so if they move at the same rate, how are you going to get different times and seasons out of that? You basically can't. So what God did was he made the stars travel a little faster around the earth in one day than the sun does in one day. So the stars, if you had machines to measure them, would revolve around the earth once per day, but they would do it in 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.1 seconds. Now, if that's the case, then it's about 4 minutes faster than the sun takes to complete one revolution around the earth, because the sun takes 24 hours. So the difference between 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.1 seconds, about 4 minutes. So what does that mean then? Well, it means on the second day that you watch the stars and the sun go around, you're going to see the sun lagging behind the stars. On the third day, you're going to see the sun lagging a little bit more behind the stars. That is, if you have a meridian point as your absolute measuring point, the stars are going to reach that in X time, but the sun is going to lag behind, okay, and by about 4 minutes. Then if you add all the times that the sun lags behind, well, it's going to take, what's going to happen is that the sun is going to appear to go through the constellations of the stars, okay, and that's going to be completed in 365.25 days, okay. So every 4 minute daily lag of the sun, say like the stars and the sun are having a race, okay, and the sun just can't keep up. And every day he's 4 minutes behind the stars, so he's never going to win the race. But you add all those 4 minute time periods up day by day, and you get to 365.25 days. So the sun that started in the constellation Aries, let's say, is going to end up in the constellation Aries at the end of 1 year. Okay. So that's the difference between a day and a year in the geocentric model. Okay. But the real difference is it's actually the sun and the stars that are moving around a fixed earth that allows this to happen. Okay. Now, one more thing we might want to say here is, okay, so what makes the sun, if everything's traveling with the universe around the earth in 23 hours, 56 minutes, what makes the sun go slower? Okay. Well, here's where you need a little physics. Because as God started the universe turning on the first day, okay, this would be the first day of creation, that whole thing is moving around, okay? And so the great light that God made on the first day is moving around the fixed earth, okay, on a 24-hour basis. But then he makes the stars on the fourth day, and he's going to make them rotate a little faster, as I said, okay, by 4 minutes. So the question is, all right, if the universe is carrying everything, including the sun, then why is the sun going a little slower? Well, all it takes is a little push from God's finger to move the sun with enough force backwards that it will take an extra 4 minutes to complete its revolution around the earth. And it keeps on doing that. Why? Because in physics, there's a principle called inertia. And once you move an object, it will continue in that motion ad infinitum. Okay. The way that Newton had phrased it, and this is one thing he got right, was inertia is the intrinsic property of a body to remain in motion unless compelled upon by a net external force. Okay. Since there is no force that is what you would call a opposing force to the sun, once God pushes it, it's going to keep on going around and around and around ad infinitum. by its own inertia, and it will be able to. Now, this is kind of hard to understand, but it is moving with the universe, okay? Except it has its own little independent movement in the opposite direction by its own inertia that allows it to be 4 minutes slower. And that's exactly what we need to have the times and seasons that we have, you see, because now we have two clocks. We have the stars being one clock, we have the sun being another clock, and you can compare one against the other, you see. That's what you need to keep time. You need to compare one against the other. Now, there's other things that occur, like there's precession. We got three different precessions of the universe, and that's like a clock also. We got one precession that takes 26,000 years to occur. We have another one that takes a couple thousand years to occur. And so they're like clocks too. So basically, God would know exactly what the precise date is for a given day because he has all these clocks in his mind that are keeping track of everything, and they never repeat. They're always different. If you add in the three precessions with the sidereal time of the stars and the solar time of the sun, you've got five different mechanisms in this clock that only God could be aware of and keep it all in view to know exactly what day it is that's distinguished from every other single day that has ever occurred since the time of creation. That's an amazing feat that God did. Okay, so yes, he can keep a hold of times and seasons because he's got all these different clocks ticking at the same time, basically, in the way he built the universe. So glory to God for that. All right. Next question. Is there any point at which the Eucharist ceases to be the Eucharist, even when it goes through someone's digestive system and it goes through sewage treatment plants? That answer would be no, there is no point. Okay. That's why we have been very meticulous about even not allowing the Eucharist to fall on the floor of the church, because now you're going to get some particles of the Eucharist on the floor. And you don't want to do that because this is the body and blood of Christ. It's another reason why we be very careful to watch people who receive the Eucharist, make sure they're not taking it out of their mouth or taking it out of their hand so that they can, do deleterious things to it and whatever they want it to use for. So, according to Catholic dogma, no, there is no time. Now, if you were a Lutheran, that would not be a no. It would be a yes, because they believe in, consubstantiation. Not that they're the standard we would even look to. I'm just telling you what they believe. That at some point, Christ leaves the Eucharist, and that's why it's called consubstantiation and not transubstantiation. Because from the Catholic view, there is no bread any longer. It's just Jesus. Okay. What we would say is, now I don't know if theologians have even discussed this point, but since you mentioned, the sewer, okay, you would have to what we had as far as we have gone in Catholic dogma is to say that once the Eucharist as the appearance of bread is no longer the appearance of bread, we say that is Christ. Okay. I don't know of any discussion that's gone beyond that because someone could object and say, well, the molecules of what makes up the wafer still exist after you digest the Eucharist. Okay. Someone else will come along and say, yes, the same molecules are there, but now they're interspersed with other molecules. And so you don't have the wafer anymore. And so, therefore, we might have a legitimate reason for saying that Christ left the Eucharist when it gets to the molecular level. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that that would have to be involved in the discussion if the church ever wants to figure this out. Okay. There's a lot of things the church hasn't figured out yet and probably never will. Maybe this is one of them, you know. I mean, when the Eucharist was invented, of course, not invented, was established by Jesus. No one was in the audience was thinking, well, what about the molecules of, that's the apostles of the Last Supper certainly weren't thinking in that direction. Okay. The only reason we would think in that direction today is because we know that things that appear to be solid, and they are, like my desk here, is actually made up of atoms and molecules and very, very small entities. Okay. So when you get down to that level, and I think this happened one time with Galileo, they actually thought Galileo was promoting a theory of the Eucharist wherein um, particulate matter down to the atomic level would not be the Eucharist. Okay. Now, the church, of course, would come in on that and say, can't go that direction. Okay. Um, um, and one reason would be, of course, a lot of this stuff is still theoretical. Okay. We talk about protons and neutrons and electrons, and we can more or less prove their existence, and we've actually seen under an electron microscope what atoms can look like. Okay. But that's a whole new field, something the church really didn't have the opportunity to discuss for what, 1900 years. I think was it Dalton who discovered the atomic structure, and that was in the 1800s. Okay, so I mean, the church hasn't even had an opportunity to get down to that level, and if she did, um, which she probably won't, then we would have our definitive answer. So I can only give you the parameters of it. I can't give you, what the church would decide. Let's take cloning, which is a totally different scientific thing. Who thought of cloning prior to the 20th century? But we've had how many instances of cloning? We've had like 36 instances of cloning animals. Okay. So then this begs the question, okay, well, what if we cloned a human being? And that begs the question to ask, would that human being have a soul? And the church has given an answer on that. I don't know if she's dogmatized it, but she has given an answer. And she said, yes, the cloned human being would have a soul, because if it's a human being, God promises to give it a soul. Okay. So we know that with cloning, because cloning basically rose to the top of the discussion where the church had to make a decision. But the molecular structure of the wafer and what would happen to the molecules and all that, the church hasn't gone there yet. Okay. So you got two different levels here, and that's as far as we can go. Okay. All right. Question from John Fredette. Commandos in World War II would sometimes commit suicide to prevent themselves from giving information to the enemy. Was this act of suicide a grave matter? Well, I think you would have to consult a number of moral theologians on this. My take would be that if he's doing it for service of his country, then it's not a sin. Okay. And the reason I say that is for the same reason I would say that, let's say you're in the battlefield and you see a grenade that the enemy just threw over, and it's landing there, and you see a man, a injured soldier, who's next to the grenade. The question would be, is it wrong for the man who sees this grenade laying next to the injured soldier? Would it be wrong for him to fall on that grenade to prevent it from exploding on the body of the injured soldier? Okay. I think that the Catholic moral theology would say, no, there is nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, they would say that's meritorious because of what Jesus said. No greater love has a man than he gives up his life for his friend. So here you have a situation where he can give up his life because he knows he's going to die. You lay on that grenade, you're dead. He knows he's going to die, but he's doing it to protect someone else. So in that sense, of course, it's not suicide. Suicide is a selfish act done only for yourself because you're despondent and you can't figure out, how to make things work or, how to get happiness out of life or whatever. And it's a selfish act. So that criteria has to be used in answering your question. And if you use that criteria, that you are giving up your life in order to protect your fellow soldiers and your country, I don't see that being a sin. Okay. Now, of course, we're riding on the edge here. Okay. We're riding on the edge. And, I'm not saying this dogmatically. Okay. I would want to talk to many moral theologians to make sure that this reasoning is correct. But that would be my, preliminary judgment. Okay. And as I said many times on this show, when you come to this show, you get my opinion. Okay. Sometimes my opinion is right, sometimes it's wrong, but you get my opinion. And that's all I can give you. Okay. Based on what I know from my studies and understanding of life and what I know of Catholic doctrine and everything, I put it all together, shake it up for you, and there you have it. Okay. So, all right. Gage says, what is speaking in tongues and how should a Catholic view speaking in tongues? All right, speaking in tongues, first of all, was a miraculous phenomenon by which a person could speak in a foreign language that he does not know, so that the person would hear the gospel or a divine message in the language with which he was familiar. Okay. Now, we've had some saints who have experienced this, for example. When they would go to foreign lands, they would be given the gift of tongues. And the reason for that was because the people there did not know the language of the preacher, and the preacher didn't know the language of the people. Okay. So, in that sense, tongues serves its original purpose, which is to be one more vehicle to preach the gospel to the world. And that was the original intent. And that's what happened at Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, we read about Jews coming to Jerusalem because they were required to come because of the Feast of Pentecost. And the Jews were at this time living in about 15 different nations, not all together that far from Jerusalem, but if you count them all, that's in the list that Peter gives or that Luke gives in Acts chapter 2. There's about 15 different regions or whatever, and they all speak a different language, even though they're Jews. Now, some of them may have known Hebrew, okay? But they would probably be the people that lived in Jerusalem or surrounding Judea to a certain extent, or Aramaic could have been another language, but not all of them. Okay, you had Greek, of course, and you had variations of Greek, and you had Phoenicians, and you had all kinds of different dialects, and I mean Chinese, for example. You think of Chinese um, as one language, but it's not. It's like 10 different languages, basically. Because even though they all come from China, there's different dialects, and one dialect can't understand another dialect. And we have that same case with many different languages in Europe, South America, Africa. It depends on the dialect you're speaking. Okay. So even if they had different dialects that were presented there in Jerusalem, the apostle would have to know what the dialect is to be able to communicate the gospel. Okay. So we can imagine that when Peter stands up there in Acts chapter 2 and gives the history of the Jews and what they did to Christ and why they did it, and we read it in English in the Bible, but we can imagine that it's going out to these 15 different regions who all have different languages or dialects, and they're all understanding it in their own tongue. Okay, that's miraculous. So this was an answer, as Peter himself said, to the prophecy of Joel. Your sons will do this, your daughters will do that, and all will hear the gospel of the Lord. And then at the end, he says, now be baptized, every one of you, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, you and your children, so that your sins may be forgiven. Okay. Well, you can't make that kind of decision unless you understand what was being told to you. And you can't understand what was being told to you unless somebody speaks it in your language. So there you have it with tongues. Okay. Now, there is some discussion, of course, when you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 14, probably 12, where the tongues gift becomes a big issue in the church because Paul gives the impression when he's describing tongues that it is not just foreign languages, but that it is a heavenly language. Okay. At least that implication is made in these chapters of the letter to the Corinthians. Now, if that's the case, we can see why this is going to present problems. Because let me just give you an example. Paul says about himself, he says, I speak in tongues more than you all. Okay. So we would ask, why is he speaking in tongues? And that's because he's implied that it's some kind of heavenly language between him and God that Paul is getting spiritual benefit out of. Okay. So that makes it an individual act. And not totally individual, but at least that an individual could practice and have another form of prayer with God if he spoke in this quote unquote heavenly language. Okay. But as soon as we cross that line and get into another level of what tongues is, we can understand why the problems arise in the Corinthian church. Because if it's not a foreign language that someone can recognize, but it's a heavenly language that has its own sort of grammar and words and vocabulary, well, that is now tempting for someone to put on an act and start talking in some kind of gibberish and pretending that the Spirit of God is filling him with tongues. And now he makes a show of this in the congregation. Everybody's going ooh and ah over this tongue speaker, but you can't prove that it actually is from heaven or not. Why? Because you don't know this language. And since we as humans have the capability to speak in gibberish, I could give you a whole string of sentences right now in gibberish. And you couldn't tell whether that was a real gift of tongues from God or just me speaking out of my own mind. Okay. So now we see that this gift is going to be a problem. And it did become a big problem because, as you will always have, you'll have those that want to make a show of themselves and stand up in the front of the congregation and start going and can try to convince everybody that they have the gift of tongues and they're special. Okay. So Paul says, look, this is not the Christian church. Okay. We're not trying to gain ascendancy over one another to try to show how holy or blessed we are from God compared to the other person. As Jesus said, look, if you want to be the greatest, then become the servant of all, and then you will become the greatest. Okay. Same in Paul's day in the Corinthian church. You want to become the greatest? Well, then be the humblest person you can be. Don't try to get center stage. Because those of us who know better know exactly what you're doing. We're not stupid. Okay. So that's why it became a problem in the church. And so Paul said, look, I'm going to lay down some rules for tongue speaking. Here they are. Number one, only one speaker at a time. At most, I want 2 or 3 doing the tongues. And out of those 3, none of you is to speak in a tongue unless there's an interpreter present. See, he got him. You see, because the congregation at large wouldn't know how to interpret a tongue, because you have to have a special gift from God to interpret someone else's tongue speech, even if it was this heavenly language, or even if he was speaking in a foreign language. Okay, we're not dismissing that as a possibility. But whatever language you're going to be speaking in a tongue, you better make sure that someone is in the congregation that has the gift of interpretation. Otherwise, you just keep quiet. Okay, because you're going to cause more problems by speaking in tongues without an interpreter than you would if there was an interpreter there. That's going to be the case. Okay. So basically, Paul just decimated this whole idea of one-upmanship in the Corinthian church by saying, you better have an interpreter. Because if the interpreter is there and he's got the gift of interpretation, and not many of these congregations did, they were far and few in between. Okay. We do know they existed, and we do know the gift of interpretation was a legitimate gift, but it wasn't going to be prolific. Okay. So before someone's going to speak in tongues, you better make sure there's an interpreter there. If not, you keep quiet. So nobody after that admonition is going to be, hey, I can speak in tongues and get up in front of the congregation, start speaking. Because if there is an interpreter there, the interpreter is going to say, he's false. He's lying. He's not speaking in tongues. He's making it up. Okay. And of course, push comes to shove, that man could be excommunicated for trying to deceive the congregation. He may get off one time, but you do that again and you're out of here. Okay. So this is why it became a problem. At the end of the story, though, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14:39, do not forbid to speak with tongues. Okay. Because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You want to get those that are perpetrating a false tongue speech, shut them up, and then let the true tongue speaker speak. Okay, that was Paul's goal. And that's why we have other accounts of tongue speaking in Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 19, and not many. Okay. At most, you have 3, possibly 4 instances, and that's it throughout the whole book of Acts. Okay. So, what does this tell us for our time? Well, it tells us for our time, and I have a book on this, by the way, if you want to read the book, called The Gift of Tongues, Blessing of God, Judgment of God. Because tongues can be a blessing, but tongues can also be a judgment. Okay. And Paul hints at that in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 22, where he says, in regard to tongue speech, let me quote to you a passage from Isaiah, where he says, with men, and the quote goes, with men of foreign lips and foreign tongues I will speak unto this people, and for all that they will still not hear me. Now, you go back and examine that passage in Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 28. You go back and examine that passage, and you find that Israel is under God's judgment. And for their punishment, because they haven't repented over many years, God is going to send the Babylonians against them. And they speak with foreign tongues, Babylonian tongues. And I'm going to take you into captivity, and you're going to be there for 70 years as your punishment. So, in other words, Paul is quoting from a passage in the Old Testament that says, basically, if you keep up these shenanigans in the church, abusing tongues, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'll send you foreign tongues, all right, but they're going to be of people that are going to come and take you away because of your abuse of this gift. So this is an ominous judgment that Paul is bringing against this Corinthian church. You either shape up or you're going to result just like the Israelites did back in Isaiah's time. Okay. And so this is not a game. This is serious business. If you try to deceive people into thinking that you have a direct communication with God when you don't. Now, this applies not only to tongue speakers, it applies to all those people out there that are claiming to have visions from God or dreams from God or this or that from God. And who's going to prove them differently? You know, the church tries her best to give approval or disapproval, but even the church sometimes is not infallible in that regard, okay? Because the local bishop's the one who's doing it usually. So he can just, gather all the data and try to figure out, well, does it meet this criteria, that criteria, all these things that I've been taught, and he makes his judgment, okay? And so that's the case, but it's a solemn warning against those who would come pretending that they have some divine message from God, whether it's in a tongue, a dream, a vision, whatever it is. Okay. And Catholics are susceptible to this kind of malarkey. Okay. I know whole groups and societies of people who live off of this stuff and are deceived right and left, north and south, because of it. Okay. So that's very dangerous. That's why Paul is laying this ominous judgment against them. You start pretending in the church that you're some spiritual crackerjack and everybody's going to follow you. And by the way, they're all making money off of it. Give the donation, to God's servant here, I see visions for you. Your family's going to be, blessed. And, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, well, sure, here, take my money. Give me some more good news. Okay. So this is a deception as old as the hills, of course. All right. But it was happening in the Corinthian church. Now, in our day, oh, we've had plenty of instances of tongue speaking, and they're all false. Okay. Every single one of them. The Protestants were the ones in the turn of the century, 1901. Her name was Agnes. Agnes, what was your last name? Anyway, 1901, she started speaking in tongues. First of all, it's a woman. And regarding tongues, women were told to keep silent. That's Paul's message in 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. Right in the midst of saying who could speak in tongues, one, two, possibly three, and you have to have an interpreter. The next thing he says is, but women are to keep silent in the church. Okay, so no tongue speaking for the women, only the men. So along comes this woman, Agnes, in 1901, and she's a Pentecostal holiness, a member of the Pentecostal Holiness Church. And we all know what they're about. And she starts speaking in tongues, and then of course everybody else starts speaking in tongues, and blah blah blah. And they can teach you how to speak in tongues because the human mind has the capability of what they call disassociation between their brain and their vocal cords, wherein they can't control their vocal cords. The brain can take over and start making them speak gibberish. Okay. They have lessons today on how you can speak in tongues. All right. So, and the Catholics in the 1960s were especially prone to this malarkey. We were just out of Vatican II, the nuns were taking off their habits, the priests were taking off their cassocks, and everybody was now free to love God the way they wanted to. Okay, so it was interpreted by those who used Vatican II, and so now we got free religion, free love. We've got you can access God just as well as a priest or the Pope can. And here's how you do it. We have this thing called tongues. And so you'd get masses of Catholics in a stadium at Notre Dame, for example, in 1966, all speaking in tongues, the whole stadium of people speaking in tongues, or what they thought was tongues, but was actually coming out of their own mind. Because tongues doesn't work that way. Paul already told us if it's going to be done, it's going to be done in the church, unless there's a missionary out there who needs to have foreign tongues to preach the gospel. Okay. But we're not going to be doing it for our own spiritual exercise, at least on massive scales like that. It's going to be done in the church, and one, two, or three at the most, and you have to have an interpreter. Those are the rules that were set down. Okay. So all this stuff about all these Catholics being filled with the Holy Spirit, and speaking in tongues, it was nothing but gibberish from their own mind. And you know how you can tell? Because it died out in a couple of years. Yeah, this was the fever. Everybody was going to speak in tongues. The whole world was going to speak in tongues. And we had some cardinals behind it who were liberal cardinals, of course, and they needed a shot in their arm for their churches because they were preaching a liberal gospel that nobody was paying attention to. And so, yeah, we need this influx of holy people coming into the church. And so they were promoting it. And we had a couple other universities, Catholic universities, doing this. And then, of course, as with all tongues that are artificial, it ends up not being useful or exciting any longer for the one who is doing it. And I've read the books on this. I've read psychology books on tongues, and they all say the same thing. After a while, the gift does nothing for them. It does nothing for them. And so why put in all the effort? Okay. They realize that it is coming from their own mind and that it's not going to make them the superstar Christian that they want to be. And then it dies by itself. It dies. So by 1967, 68, nobody at Notre Dame was speaking in tongues anymore. Okay. As well as the other universities. It took a little while to die out, but by the early 1970s, hardly anybody was speaking in tongues anymore. Okay. Or what they thought was tongues. So this just proves the falsity of the whole endeavor. Okay. So yeah. Anyway, if you want more information on that and the names involved, by the way, who in the church were promoting it, get my book, The Gift of Tongues, Blessing of God, Judgment of God, and you'll find out all about it. Okay. Michael Lawler says, better time for us in England. Well, that's great. Michael, other people in Europe have told me that. So I'm glad everybody's benefiting from it. People in the US and people in Europe. So that is wonderful. All right. So next question from MN123456. All right. Question. Can you describe in detail the moon's motion in the geocentric system, specifically how the 28-day phase cycle works? Yeah. Now, remember, we just talked about the sun and the stars. Okay. And wherein we said that the stars have what they call the sidereal rate, go around the Earth in 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4.1 seconds. The sun is a little slower, okay, and because it has a little inertia to keep it going in what we call a retrograde motion, and that travels around the Earth in 24 hours, which is about 4 minutes difference than the stars. Well, the moon also has an independent movement, okay? And it has enough inertia to make it travel around the Earth. First of all, the moon's going to travel around the Earth with the universe and the sun. They're all going to be traveling and complete their revolution in one day, plus or minus, okay? But then there's a additional movement that the moon has, and it continues that movement by its own inertia. And that inertia will make it travel around the Earth independently of the universe that's also making it go around the Earth in 28 days. Okay, so you have the stars, the sun, and the moon. They all have what you would call a universal movement, all going around the Earth in 24 hours plus or minus, and the sun and the moon have an independent movement of a little bit of a retrograde motion. Just a little, but it's enough, as we said, for the sun to travel through the zodiac, the 12 constellations of the zodiac in that retrograde motion, which makes up our year, 365 days, 365.25 days. Okay. So same with the moon. Now, this becomes important when passages used by the church, namely Cardinal Robert Bellarmine against Galileo. Okay. Because Robert Bellarmine used Joshua chapter 10 to counter Galileo's teaching that the earth was the one that was going around the sun, not the sun around the earth. And so Robert Bellarmine, smart individual as he was, raised Joshua 10. And what happened in Joshua 10? Well, Joshua is fighting against 5 foreign armies. And he gets the strategic point on a mountain, which means the 5 armies that are against him are trying to climb up the mountain to kill him and the Israelites, okay? and they're far outnumbered, the Israelites. But Joshua is having a good time killing these, the Amorites and all kinds of ites are out there, because he's got the superior position in the military fashion of the term, wherein the sun is above him on the mountain, and the sun is glaring in the eyes of the armies that are trying to climb up the mountain to kill Joshua and the Israelites. Okay. So Joshua sees that this is a strategic vantage point from which to win this war, even though he's completely outnumbered 5-1, probably even worse. And so the thought comes into his head, well, you know what? If I can only stay up here another day, I could wipe these guys out, because they just can't get around the sun. The sun's glaring in their eyes. Now, this is at 12 noon that he thinks this. And the sun is what? At high noon, it's right there, and that you get the most glare from the sun at high noon. And so he says, hey, here's what I'll do. Let me ask God to keep the sun there for 24 more hours, and I will have accomplished all that I need to accomplish, because I see how it's going. They can't fight me because of the glare. And so just add another 24 hours to that. And God says, sure, I can do that. And so he does it. He stops the sun. Okay. Now, for 24 hours, he stops the sun in the sky. And Joshua is able to defeat these 5 armies, decimate them. And Galileo was forced to explain this to Robert Bellarmine and said, well, the reason that the sun could stay up in the sky is not because God stopped the sun, but because he stopped the earth from rotating. Okay. So now it is true that if the earth stopped rotating, if it was rotating in the beginning and it stopped, then wherever the sun was at that point in time, the sun would stay there. Okay. That would be true. Logically true. But then you have this little object called the moon. Okay. Now, since the moon has an independent movement from the sun, that means the moon, if you stop the earth from rotating, is going to do what? It's going to keep on revolving. Okay. So, because the moon has an independent movement, and that independent movement, if you allow it to manifest itself, now, first you have to understand this. The sun is at 90 degrees. The moon is right over the Mediterranean at about 30 degrees. Okay. So it's not going to take a long time for the moon to go down further and dip into the Mediterranean. You give it enough hours, its independent movement is going to do that. So let's say the Earth stopped rotating. Well, the moon's going to keep on going. And guess what? In about 5 to 10 hours, give or take, it's going to dip below the Mediterranean Sea. And so what would that do? Well, that would make Joshua 10 false, because Joshua 10 is explicit that both the sun and the moon stopped in the sky for a whole day. But if the moon's going to dip into the Mediterranean, obviously it ain't stopped. It kept on going. Okay, so this is what Bellarmine used against Galileo. And of course, Galileo, in his irascible way, tried to figure something else out. But you can read Galileo's letter. It's in my book, Geocentrism 101, what he tried to do, and Galileo was wrong. It's in there as well. So that's why it's important to understand that the 28-day cycle of the moon is an independent movement. based on its own inertia to go around the Earth, even though it's still carried by the universe around the Earth on a daily basis. Okay, so at any rate, one thing about the good old Galileo is Galileo prior to 1639 was not a good Catholic. Okay. This guy was part of an underground movement to undermine the church in whatever way he could. And since he was a scientist, one of the ways that he saw fit to do was to embarrass the church, scientifically speaking, to undermine her authority. Because once you can pull that plug and make the church look stupid, then everybody's going to be questioning their authority on every other issue that comes up. Like today, contraception. Well, the church got Galileo wrong. That was a scientific issue. Well, what about contraception? Yeah, I've actually read Galileo historians, Catholic Galileo historians, arguing from that basis. Well, if the church got Galileo wrong, well, what about other things like, contraception or surrogate motherhood or, all kinds of things that you could give on a list that are partially scientific and also moral that the church would have to deal with. Okay. So, like she dealt with cloning. That's on a scientific basis. And yet the church came in and gave the moral conclusion of what a cloned human being would necessarily have to have. That is a human soul. Okay. So when the church is forced into these scientific areas, she may or may not have to give a definitive decision. But in the case of Galileo, she did. And she said, no, Scripture is clear. The fathers were clear. The medievals were clear. The earth doesn't move. Period. End of story. So whatever contraption you can think of, like Galileo did, said, well, the way we explain Joshua 10 is by, the earth stopped rotating. Okay. That's what the church said. Now, you either believe it, accept it, or you don't. Okay. Most people don't today. Fine. But Galileo, during his whole life, basically wanted to undermine the church using science. And then, even after he was accosted by the church, put to trial, and put on what they call that, probation on the grounds of the Vatican. Forget the special term for that. By 1639, which was 6 years after his trial under Pope Urban VIII, Galileo had a dramatic conversion experience, and he became a true Catholic. Prior to that, he was a fake Catholic seeking to undermine the church. Then he became a true Catholic. And one reason we know this is because a friend of his came knocking on his door one day. What was his name? Giovanni Rinuccini, and said to Galileo, I have an astronomer that's found stellar parallax, and we have proof that the Earth is moving. Now, anybody who knows about this whole scientific area knows that stellar parallax, number one, is not going to prove that the Earth is moving, because the geocentric system has its own explanation for stellar parallax with a fixed Earth that's not moving. Okay, all you have to do is move the stars instead of the Earth, and voila, you have stellar parallax. It's not a big deal, except it's not been put in the grade school books and the high school books and the college books for people to know. It's been hidden. Okay. But trust me, they can explain it just as well as the Copernicans can. But let's just say in Galileo's time, he didn't know that. He wouldn't have known that. But Galileo wrote a 3-page letter back to Rinuccini and said, no, it's impossible for the earth to move around the sun because God says no. And obviously, God has enough power to make the earth fix and to make the stars and the sun revolve around it. He doesn't need any coaching or any help from anybody. He's God and he can do it. Okay. And this is what the scriptures say. This is what the fathers say, blah, 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 blah. And he wrote a 3-page scientific and theological letter back to Rinuccini and told him this. And we know from other sources that Galileo had this dramatic conversion experience in 1639, where before Galileo was a deadbeat dad, he was so irascible to his colleagues that nobody liked him. He was an adulterer. He was not a sex maniac, but he was into it pretty heavy and had illegitimate children. I mean, not your ideal Catholic, let's say. And then he had his conversion experience where everything changed. And the first indication of that was what he wrote to Rinuccini about the geocentric universe and that God can make it. And as a matter of fact, when Rinuccini got the letter from Galileo, and we have their letter recorded, okay? And here's another thing. This letter didn't appear until 1968, okay? So for 4 centuries, this letter has been hidden from us. Not only did we find it, but the people that examined the letter noticed that Galileo's name was, someone tried to erase Galileo's name from off the letter so that no one would know that he wrote it. Okay. And, you can't fool stenographers and people who do this for a living today. You just can't. So it took our scientific prowess that we've gained from meticulous investigatory efforts to find out that, yeah, somebody tried to erase Galileo's name so that no one would know that he wrote it, but he did. Okay. Now we know that. So, for all that we have stated about Galileo in the past, very few people know about this conversion experience he had. And Galileo, from everything I can find, is probably in heaven today, cheering us on. Just the opposite of what the world thinks of Galileo. He thinks they're cheering them on, So just figured I'd give you that little historical tidbit to let you know how God is leveling the playing field, as they say. All right, so let me move on to the next question. What do you think of Pope Francis's passion for the tango? I just wish Pope Francis would have more passion for Catholic doctrine and preserving the traditions of the church and not cowering to the homosexuals and the abortionists and everything else he's been doing in the past year or so. We need a pope to get serious. Otherwise, he's going to be doing his tango with God And that ain't going to be filled with music, I can guarantee you. Okay, I'm surprised to see Bob streaming at this time. This isn't a rerun. No, even though it may look like a rerun, it's not a rerun. This is live. All right. Robert Dean says, question, 6-day trailer is awesome. When will the DVD download be available? Give it a couple weeks there, Robert. We're working feverishly to put the final touches on the first DVD, day one of our DVD series called How the World Was Made in 6 Days. And as a matter of fact, we started on day two. The script's already been written. It's just a matter of putting it in film now. So we're working. We're running as fast as we can. Believe me. But give it a couple weeks, and we'll be out. And then you can let me know what you think. All right. Question, Robert. Why did God create? Ooh. Excuse me a minute. Why did God create? Now, that might seem like a real simple question. And on one level, it is. But then when you start thinking about who God is, and on one dimension of who God is, you would say, well, God's perfect. God doesn't need anybody. God lived for eternity without anybody. Of course, that's hard to say because we don't even know what eternity is. I mean, God says, I am who I am. He's always existed. So, I mean, it's like, is it right to say that God lived for eternity? Only in the sense that we have to use words. May that be correct. But what does that actually mean? That God's existed for eternity? Because as soon as you just put words on it like eternity, it makes you think of an endpoint. Somewhere God started in the back somewhere and lived all through that time, and now we're here, and that's a long time from now until whenever it started. But you can't think that way because God never started, of course. He just is. Okay, so it's hard for us to use argument language to try to wrap our heads around this, but that entails the fact that if God, or since God has been here for eternity, if that's what we can use, then obviously he didn't need anybody, right? And we had Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they loved each other and lived with each other and existed with each other for all eternity. So why would he need somebody else? Or do you want to say that God doesn't create out of need? He just creates because he wants to. Well, why did he want to? What changed? Okay. I mean, that is a logical, legitimate question. Was there something that changed in God? That God now decided, hey, it's a good idea to create more beings. So, these questions are difficult to answer. They're difficult. So that's one side of it we have to deal with. Now, the other side, the other dimension of God, well, who is God? When we try to ask that question and answer it, is God is a personal being. And I make this emphasis because we hear a lot into a mystic theology that God is being, and being is the first important category of philosophy or metaphysics. And in a sense, yes, that's correct. As a matter of fact, being or existence takes the precedence over every other metaphysical category. Okay. But see, that gives the impression when you talk of God as just being, just existing, that it's no different than any other thing that exists. Okay. Now, I don't mean to imply that that's what Thomas meant in this totality of thinking. I'm just saying in the metaphysical area, when we're dealing with the existence of God, we say God is being. That's the most important thing. Okay. As far as metaphysics goes. But we have a God who's more than just being. We have a God who is a personal being, personal, someone with a personality. Okay. I don't know. The only way I can compare is say, God's not a rock. He might be analogously a rock, like Jesus, but, God's not an inanimate object where we could say that just by the fact that this inanimate object is existing, it has superiority over everything else. We don't want to go there because God is different than that. God is a personal being with a personality, which means that if you have a personality, you have love, you have understanding, you have wisdom, all those qualities that someone who is personal has. He's compassionate, he pities, he feels for us. He, everything that you would think of in a personality, think of it as the exponential personality in God. Okay. So God is somebody you can talk to. You can't talk to a rock, okay, because it'll never answer you back, of course. But you can talk to God. You can communicate with God. That's what the Trinity does. They communicate with one another. As hard as that is to understand, you have three different persons with three different personalities communicating with each other. I just read that passage. I think we went over this last week in Psalm 110, where this was prompted by Jesus, his confrontation with the Pharisees. And he just brought up out of thin air. They already tried to trap him twice and they failed. So Jesus comes back and says, hey, what about this? In the Psalms, it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my feet while I make your enemies your footstool. And Jesus says, well, look, this was written by David. So why is he calling him Lord when David also says that the Lord came after him? It doesn't make sense, does it? And so Jesus points to this passage in Psalm 110 and says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit thou as I put your enemies at your footstool. And in the Hebrew, it's Yahweh says to Adonai, sit thou at my right hand while I make your enemies your footstool. And you get this, wow, oh my gosh. You've got two different personalities here. One called Yahweh and one called Adonai speaking to each other. Okay. Now that's what we call a personal being. Okay. And they speak to each other with love and respect and honor. It's the whole reason Jesus went to the cross, to save the honor of the Father, Yahweh. And wow, okay, so if that is the case, that we're not just talking about being, but we're talking about personal being, it's a lot easier to see why God created. Okay. Because if you've already got the good stuff, that is the personal communication and love between the Trinity, you want more of it. Okay. Not because you need it, but because you're going to enjoy having more of it, just a fact of nature, so to speak. Okay. And so you create this man and you want fellowship with him right away. And you want him to create also. So both of you can now enjoy the fellowship of love and communion and um, compassion and wisdom and all those qualities that are in a personal being and enjoy it for eternity. The more you have, the better it is. Okay. So I think that answers the reason why God created. Okay. Because of who he is. And who he is a personal being. And personal beings just want more. Now it's like going out into the garden and smelling a rose. Okay. So you smell the rose. And what do you want to do after that? Give me another one. Give me another rose to smell. Or give me a lilac, or give me whatever it is that smells good. I just want more of it. And not only do I want more of it, I get a diversity of these good things to experience and share back and forth with one another. Because I'll smell the rose and I'll say, hey, to my wife, here, smell this rose. And she gets enjoyment out of it. And then I pick the lilac up and say, oh, that smells good. And then give it to everybody else to smell. And we all enjoy it, you see, because we all enjoy the good things of life and the personal interchange that we have in sharing those things. You see, it makes life worth living. And that's all we've got, brother. That's it. So we better make it good. Of course, Adam didn't make it so good. He thought he had a better way to get to the top, so to speak, than what God had designed for him and sort of flubbed it up for everybody. But glory be to God, this personal being thought of a way to get it back. And you know what he decided? I love them so much because I'm a personal being that I'm willing to become a man and die and save the honor of my Father so that all those who want to be a part of this can still be a part of it. Wow. Now that's a personal being. That's a being who loves. That's a being who cares. Okay? So that's why I try to make this distinction in the beginning. It's not just being, it's personal being. That's what distinguishes God and makes him who he is. And if you don't believe me, go read the Old Testament. Find out how God talks to these men he's dealing with. Noah, Abraham, David. I mean, look at the personal aspect of God's divinity in dealing with these men. As great as God is, how he condescends to speak to them lovingly, hopefully, faithfully, with wisdom and honor between them, in total respect of them. You see, that's what makes God God. And boy, if we could get that without any sin in the world, just think how good it would be. And that's what God plans for us. Okay? To share that personalness for eternity without any sin getting in the way. Now, that's something to look forward to. Okay? In your short life on earth, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, whatever, that's not very much to ask for an eternity of absolute personal bliss with people whom you love and no sin is going to get in the way. There you have it. That's the gospel. All right. Ricardo Reyes says, what's the best response to orthodox argument that the formula of Hormisdas may be a fraud, or was it altered? What I would recommend to you, Ricardo, is I want you to get a hold of the book that we just published, called, what is it called? I can't believe I forget. Um, Let me find out what it is. Um, Hold on. Keys over the Christian world. Okay. Now this one's in hardback. All right. But this whole question of the formula of Hormisdas is inside here. And you need to read the whole context in order to get the whole picture. Okay. So I'm going to leave that to you to purchase, and you can go to robertsongenis.org to get that book and find out what the issue is. Okay. So I'm going to pass the buck here. Question: how could Adam and Eve have known the meaning of the punishment for disobeying God, namely death, given their state of innocence and their ignorance of what death was? Well, God would have explained it to them. See, there's a lot in Genesis that is just descriptive, but as I said, it doesn't get in between the lines, so to speak. Okay. And it just gives you sort of the bare bones of what happened. Okay. And if you want to find out the motives, the reasons, the other issues involved, all that stuff, you sort of have to have this other dimension of analysis where you figure out, okay, this has to be the case because that's the case here and that's the case here, and you figure it out logically. Okay. Now, you may be wrong sometimes, okay, but you know there was much more going on than what the text tells you, okay? And that's where the art of exegesis comes into play. And it's a fascinating art, okay? Because sometimes you can go off in all different directions and they may not be right, but you know that something else is going on there, okay, to glue this thing together and have it hold. So that's what we figure what would happen. Everything Adam had to know, he knew. God was not going to leave him ignorant. And you know how it says, and God walked in the cool of the day and said, Adam, Adam, where are you? Well, what does that tell you? Well, they were communicating prior to that. Prior to Adam's fall, God and Adam were communicating. And God told Adam everything he needed to know. That what was on the line and what the consequences would be. Okay. So when God says to Adam, was it Genesis 2:7 or 2:17? One or the other. He goes, of all the fruit of the garden you may eat, except the one in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day you eat of it, you shall die. Okay. That's the bare bones. But there's more that went on around that, before that and after that we know that God communicated to Adam so that there would be nothing that was left out for him to make the right decision. Okay? And that's just because we have a just God. I talked about him just a few minutes ago being the personal God. Well, if you're going to be a personal God, you're not going to leave your creature you just created out on the lurch, to figure everything out for himself. You're going to let him know what the parameters are, what he needs to know to do the right thing. You're going to teach him. Okay. And we don't know how long it was until Adam fell. It could have been a day, a week, a month, a year, who knows? We don't know. But whatever that was, God took that time to communicate to him exactly what he needed to know, and Eve as well. Okay. And this is what makes the sin so heinous. Because even all that they knew, or even if they had infused knowledge. And some of that would have to be true, some infused knowledge. So you get the infused knowledge plus what God told them. After all of that, they somehow, some way, got deceived into thinking that they didn't need God, that they could become their own gods and wouldn't have to be subservient to him or be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth like God wanted. They would be free of all that and not have to be obedient to anyone. Okay? So this is the puzzle. Why did they come to that decision? Well, that just tells you how deceptive the devil was. And then Eve doing it to Adam, and Adam's just sitting there, you know. Maybe he's just stunned. Who knows? I don't know what went on in his mind, but it was great enough to deceive him where he didn't do the right thing, even after all he knew. And God would make sure that he knew what he needed to know. After all, the whole humanity is on the line. The whole of humanity is on the line. Okay? So, all right. All right, so we have a few minutes left. We'll see how many more questions I can get to. All right, God. Question. Here's a question. I enjoy your interviews with other people like you, Michael Jones, and John Salza. Are there any plans to invite people to your program to debate, interview them on hot topics? Yes, we have Michael Varis coming on the show either next week, the week after, or the week after that, sometime in January. He has to give me the day that he's free, being the busy guy that he is. And we're going to go for 2 hours with Michael Varis here. And then we're going to have other people coming probably once a month to the program, and I will interview them and on their particular expertise. And so to answer your question, the answer is yes. Question, how to reconcile the teaching on the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist with the teaching of St. Paul, the apostle, that God blank blank is not housed in buildings made with hands. Well, because you're talking about two different contexts there. I think the one you're talking about with St. Paul is Acts 17, and where he's talking to the Athenians on Mars Hill, and he's trying to tell them that, you know, you have all these statues to the god of your choice, you know, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, whatever god they have, and you also have a statue to the unknown god. Okay, which tells me something. That tells me that you're not sure you got all the gods right, or if you have enough gods, or you're waiting for the true God to step in and say, none of these gods are real. I'm the only one that's real. Otherwise, why would you have a statue to the unknown God? It means you're not sure. Okay, and you're hoping that someday you will be sure, and that can only be when the true God comes. Okay, so he's basically trying to tell them, you can't confine God to a statue. You can't confine him to a house. God is, of course, much bigger than that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God, would he? Okay, I mean, if your God's an idol and you sit down and pray to it, well, evidently you don't have a great concept of God because it's confined to a piece of wood. Okay, so he's trying to get across the idea that you got to expand your horizons if you want to think about God, just like we did when we talked about God from all eternity. And, you know, he's the personal God that wants us to live with him for all eternity because he enjoys it. Okay, so that's expanding your horizons. These guys didn't have that concept, the Athenians. They had they just they knew there was something itching in their mind, but they just couldn't figure it all out. And the best they could come up with is to make these idols. And Paul says, no, that's not the way to go. Okay. Now, when God wants to confine himself to a particular thing, he can do that. Because why? Because he's God. He has that ability. So he can put his body, soul in and divinity in a wafer because that's his prerogative to do it when he wants to do it. Okay. And we have the right to worship that wafer because it is God. Okay. But that's when God decides to do it. And why does he decide to do that? Well, if you read 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2, what is Paul arguing about? What is he concerned about? Well, he's concerned about the Greeks and their so-called wisdom. All those philosophers that they had, you know, Democritus, Plato, Aristotle, blah, 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 Euripides, all those people, and they had wisdom, okay? And the gospel is this story about this guy who claims to be God, and he dies on a cross, and he supposedly rises from the dead, and that's it. And he says, you're a bunch of sinners and you need to repent, and if you don't, you're on your way to hell. And what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like somebody from the first grade could make that up. I don't mean to be crass here at all, but compared to the Greek wisdom, the philosophers and the metaphysicians and all those guys who can, make triangles and Pythagorean theorem and all this stuff, compared to the gospel, that sounds like really intelligent. And my gosh, what could we do without it? And Paul says, that's all bunk. Here's the real truth. Yeah, there's this guy that came and said he was God, died on the cross for your sins, rose from the dead so that you can be with him forever. Period. Okay? And Paul says, well, that's foolishness to the Greeks because they're super intelligent, They put triangles together and, show how smart they are. And Paul says, no, that's just all foolishness. To us, it's foolishness. And our gospel to them, well, that's just foolishness. Come on, man. Somebody rising from the dead? That doesn't happen. Okay? Somebody came from the heavens and said he was God? Come on, that doesn't happen. So they think it's foolishness. And it's so simple. You guys haven't figured out how the world works. We've figured out how the world works. We're Greeks. You see? We can tell you the difference between an isosceles triangle and a right triangle. Come on now, give us some credit. So Paul's fighting against this idea that, you have to be intelligent to understand everything and, to be worth anything and all this stuff. Paul says, come on, how many of you Christians in the Corinthian church were people of stature? Nobles, kings, princes, physicians, mathematicians. How many of you? Hardly any of you. Okay? All of you basically came from common stock. Because God doesn't want these people who think they know everything and who think a message as simple as the gospel is foolishness. Okay? He doesn't want them. So that's what he's fighting against. And what is a guy who thinks he knows everything going to do when he sees this little wafer and you tell him that's God? What's he going to think? he's going to think you're ready for the loony bin. Okay. So, but see, that's exactly what God wants to do. He wants to humble these people. And Paul says he picks the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. The things that the world thinks are stupid, like a little wafer being God, is stupid. Okay. And he wants to use that to confound the wise. Yes, this little wafer is how I'm going to speak to you day in and day out, to confound the wise who think, oh wow, we have to figure out what pi equals and put all these shapes together and figure out how they all fit together. Oh no, 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 no. Okay. That's what the world's deceived into thinking that they have to do. Somehow climb high mountains or tread deep seas to find the truth. And there will be the Dalai Lama waiting for them. Okay, no. It's very simple, as Paul said in what, First Corinthians, or was that Romans 10, where you want to find God? Well, you don't have to tread deep seas, climb high mountains, because he's sitting right here next to you. Yep, that God will humble himself as much as he has to sit right next to you. Okay? Why? Because he doesn't want anybody coming to him that thinks they knows everything, that's not willing to humble himself and say, God, compared to you, I know nothing. No, he doesn't want those kind of people. So consider yourself fortunate that not many of you are noble and of high place or, adulated by the world. Those people rarely make it into the kingdom. Okay, rarely. So, I hope you can see the difference between the two. Okay. All right, we've come to the end of the program, unfortunately, and it looks like I haven't even gotten halfway down my list here. So save your questions until next time, people, and I'll try to make a copy of this and look them over and see if there's anything that I should bring up next time. I'm going to try to make that a practice for upcoming shows because I hate you guys to, keep waiting for 2 hours for your question to be answered. And, comes time where I have to go. So let me do that right now before I forget. Okay, so I do have to go, and it was lovely having you here. I hope the time between 3 and 5 in the afternoon EST, the Eastern Standard Time, is good for everyone. I haven't heard any complaints yet, so it looks like I picked a good time, not only for myself, but for everybody else. So again, thank you for being here, and if you could, go by, here is my name and website, Robert Sungenis at robertsungenis.org. If you feel moved, please give us a little donation so that we can keep on going. And if you want to become a monthly contributor, $10 a month would sure help us. I know things are tight these days, but if you can, please do. Okay, so I got to go. We'll see you next January 11th. And we'll be here again at 3 p.m. God love you. Keep the faith.